cell is small enough that a man cannot pace more than 3 steps before the wall stops him. The walls are stone. The floor is stone. The light comes from a single opening near the ceiling. Not a window, just a gap. And in winter, the cold moves through it like something alive. There is a chain. It connects his wrist to the wrist of a Roman soldier who sits beside him and does not speak. The man in the cell is old now. His eyes have been failing for years. His back carries the memory of 5 separate floggings. His body has been shipwrecked, stoned, beaten with rods, left for dead on a road outside a city that did not want him. He is somewhere between 60 and 70 years old, which in the first century means he is ancient. He has no family in the city. He has no money. He has no political allies left. One by one, they drifted away when the danger became real. And yet, he is writing. He is writing a letter. It will be the last letter he ever writes. And before he finishes it, he will make one final request of the young man he loves most in the world. Not a request for a lawyer, not a request for a pardon, not a request for rescue. He asks for his scrolls and a winter coat. We will come back to that request, but not yet, because this is not a story about a death cell. This is not a story about an execution. This is not a story about the end of a man's life. This is a story about 13 letters written across 16 years. Letters from roadside inns and borrowed houses, from rented rooms and open courtyards, from a city in Greece and a prison in Rome, by a man who had no business writing any of them. His name was Paul. He had spent the first half of his life hunting Christians. He dragged them out of their homes. He held the coats of the men who stoned the first Christian martyr to death in the street. He was, by his own admission, the last person on earth who should have written a single word of the New Testament. And he wrote more of it than anyone else. 13 letters, 16 years. Every one of them a response to a crisis. Every one of them opened with the same word. Charis, grace. Rewind to the beginning. Corinth, AD 51. A city of 100,000 people in every kind of vice you can imagine. A man sits down, picks up a pen, and writes the oldest letter in the New Testament. Corinth in AD 51 is not a quiet city. It is a port. It sits on a narrow strip of land between 2 seas, which means every ship from the Eastern Mediterranean passes through it. And every sailor from every one of those ships comes looking for something to spend money on. It has temples to a dozen gods. It has gambling. It has every kind of pleasure the ancient world had figured out how to sell. It is loud, incommercial, and morally indifferent, which means if you're the Apostle Paul, it is exactly the kind of city you want to plant a church in. Paul arrived in Corinth alone. He had just come from Athens, where his sermon at the Areopagus had produced a handful of converts and very little else. He was, by his own account, with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. He found a Jewish couple named Aquila and Priscilla who were tent makers like him, and he moved into their house and worked at their bench and preached in their synagogue until they threw him out. And somewhere in that city, in a rented room or at a workbench while his hands were busy with canvas and thread, he picked up a pen and wrote the first letter. First Thessalonians. You have to understand what Thessalonica was to Paul. He had planted that church 18 months earlier on his second missionary journey, and he had been forced out of the city by a riot before he could finish what he started. He left behind a congregation of new believers, mostly Gentiles, people who had never read a Hebrew scripture in their lives. And He had not been able to go back. He sent Timothy to check on them. And when Timothy returned with the report, Paul sat down and wrote, "Here's what most people miss about First Thessalonians. It is not primarily a theological treatise. It is a love letter." He writes, "We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Our lives, not our doctrine, not our program. Our lives. But there is a crisis. People in the Thessalonian church have been dying of illness, of old age, of something, and the congregation is terrified. They believe Jesus was coming back soon. What happens to the ones who die before he comes? Did they miss it? Are they lost?" Paul writes to answer that question. He introduces a Greek word that will echo through Christian theology for 2,000 years. Parousia, the coming, the presence. He tells them the dead in Christ will rise first. They have not missed anything. Hold on. 6 months later, something has gone wrong with that answer. Either Paul's letter was misread, or a forged letter was circulating in his name, or someone simply took his words further than he intended. Because now, the Thessalonians have stopped working. Why plant crops if the world is ending next week? Why pay rent? Paul writes again. 2 Thessalonians, shorter, firmer. Get back to work. 2 letters, 1 city, 1 terrified young church. Now move forward 2 years. Galatia, and this is where it gets remarkable. Paul plants churches across the region of Galatia on his first and second missionary journeys. Communities of Gentile believers who have never been circumcised, never kept the Jewish law, never observed the dietary codes. He tells them they are free. The law has been fulfilled. Grace is enough. Then he leaves, and teachers arrive behind him, Jewish Christians from Jerusalem, who tell the Galatian churches that Paul got it wrong. Grace is not enough. You also need to be circumcised. You also need to keep the law. You need both. When word reaches Paul, he does not write a calm theological rebuttal. He explodes. Galatians is the only letter Paul writes with no opening prayer, no thanksgiving, no warmth. He goes directly from his name to the confrontation. "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you." In chapter 2, he tells a story of the moment he confronted the apostle Peter, the leader of the Jerusalem church, the man Jesus called the Rock, to his face in public because Peter was being a coward about eating with Gentiles when the Jewish Christians were watching. Paul called out Peter by name to his face. He uses the word anathema, curse, twice in 2 verses. If anyone preaches a different gospel, let them be cursed. If an angel from heaven comes and changes this, let the angel be cursed. He is not being rhetorical. He means it. And then, at the end of the letter, something quietly devastating happens. His scribe has been writing for him. Paul dictated most of his letters because of his eyesight. But at the end of Galatians, Paul takes the pen himself. He writes, "See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand." Large letters, because he can barely see, because his eyes are going, because he wants them to know this part came directly from him, shaking hand and all. Stay with me. Because 1 year later in Ephesus, Paul receives a report about the church in Corinth, and what he hears is almost unbelievable. There is a man sleeping with his stepmother, and the church is proud of it. There are lawsuits between believers being argued in pagan courts. There are people getting drunk at the Lord's Supper while others go hungry at the same table. There are factions, some people claiming to follow Paul, others claiming Apollos, others claiming Peter, others claiming Christ directly. as if the name you used was a team jersey. Paul writes First Corinthians, 13 chapters of confrontation, instruction, correction, and rebuke. The longest letter he has written so far. And then, without warning, in chapter 13, the tone changes completely. You have heard this passage read at weddings. You have seen it printed on greeting cards. You have heard it recited by people who have no idea what came before it. Paul did not write 1 Corinthians 13 for people in love. He wrote it for a church that was tearing itself to pieces. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. He wrote it to people who were showing off their spiritual gifts at each other's expense. He wrote it to people who were suing each other. He wrote it to a congregation that had confused spiritual power with spiritual maturity. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not boast. He was not describing romance. He was describing what they were failing to be. 3 letters down, 10 to go. Here is the pattern you need to see before we go further. Every single letter Paul has written so far, everyone, was a response to a crisis. Not one of them was written from a comfortable chair in a quiet room with nothing pressing on him. The Thessalonians were terrified. The Galatians were being misled. The Corinthians were self-destructing. Paul does not write when things are fine. Paul writes when things are on fire. If this is landing for you, subscribe, because the letters get heavier from here. We are not even halfway through, and the worst is still coming. Now, 2 Corinthians. You need to understand something about the relationship between Paul and the Corinthian church before you read this letter. In the year between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, something happened that Paul calls his painful visit. A confrontation so bad, so humiliating, so devastating that he left Corinth in tears and swore he would not come back until things changed. Someone in that church had publicly attacked him, had undermined his authority, had questioned whether he was even a real apostle. Paul sent Titus ahead to test the atmosphere, and while he waited for Titus to return, he writes, "When I came to Troas, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He crossed into Macedonia, still not knowing whether his relationship with Corinth was salvageable. When Titus finally arrived with good news, the church had disciplined the offender. They had repented. They wanted Paul back. Paul sits down and writes 2 Corinthians. And this letter is different from everything before it, but it gets stranger because 2 Corinthians is the most personal thing Paul ever wrote. The mask comes off. The theological scaffolding comes down. And what you see underneath is a man who is exhausted, genuinely, deeply, spiritually exhausted, and is trying to explain to people who doubted him exactly what this life has cost. He lists it out, not as a complaint, as evidence. 5 times he received the Jewish punishment of 39 lashes. You need to hold that number in your mind. 39 lashes, one fewer than 40 because 40 was considered potentially fatal, and they wanted to punish without quite killing. 5 times. That is 195 lashes across his back. 3 times he was beaten with Roman rods. Once he was stoned and left for dead outside the city of Lystra, dragged out through the gates like garbage and left on the road. 3 times he was shipwrecked. Once he spent a full night and day floating in open water before rescue came. Add to that, constant travel on roads where bandits were not a theoretical risk. Sleepless nights, days without food, cold. And then he says this, After all of that, after all the physical suffering, he says the thing that weighs on him most heavily every single day is the anxiety he carries for all the churches, not his own pain, their fragility. And then he tells you about the thorn. He does not name it. Scholars have been arguing for 20 centuries about what it was. Chronic eye disease, malaria, a speech impediment, epilepsy, the ongoing psychological weight of his past. He calls it a messenger of Satan, sent to torment him. He says he begged God 3 times to take it away. God said no. God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 3 times Paul asked. 3 times God said no. And Paul, the man who had been flogged 5 times, shipwrecked 3 times, stoned, and left for dead, says that answer was enough. More than enough. He says, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." You will not find that kind of logic in a philosophy textbook. You only arrive at that sentence through suffering. You only mean it if you have been through something that did not kill you but came close, and found on the other side that you were still standing. Not because you were strong, because something else was. The Greek word running through 2 Corinthians like a thread is parakaleo, to comfort, to urge, to come alongside. It is the word for what God does to Paul in the thorn. It is the word for what Paul does to the Corinthians through the letter, to stand beside someone in their worst moment and refuse to leave. Paul writes 2 Corinthians somewhere around AD 55 or 56. He is a free man. He is still traveling. He still has years ahead of him. But something in this letter sounds like a man who has started to understand what the end will look like. Pay attention to this, because 1 year later, in Corinth, of all places, the city that nearly broke him, Paul sits down to write the letter he has been building toward his entire ministry, Romans. He has never been to Rome. He is writing to a church he did not plant, in a city he has never visited, in the capital of the empire that will one day execute him. He has no personal history with these people, no crisis to respond to, at least not a local one. He is writing because he wants to come, eventually, and use Rome as a base to push the mission all the way to Spain. He wants them to know who he is and what he believes before he arrives. So, he writes everything. Romans is Paul's longest letter, his most carefully constructed argument. 8 chapters of theology so dense that Augustine, reading it in a garden in Milan 400 years later, will have his entire life reordered by a single passage. Martin Luther, reading it 1,000 years after that, will nail 95 theses to a church door and split the Western world in half. But here is the moment that stops you. Chapter 8. Paul is building toward his conclusion, this long, sweeping argument about sin and grace and the Spirit and adoption and glory. And he lands on a sentence that has been spoken over more graves than almost any other in Scripture. "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." He writes that as a free man. He writes it from Corinth. He writes it before the arrest, before the trials, before the chains. But there is something in those words that sounds like a man who already knows he will need them. The historian Josephus, writing about Rome in this same period, describes a city already trembling under Nero, an emperor who has begun to see enemies everywhere and whose paranoia is becoming policy. The clouds are gathering. Paul can feel them. He writes Romans anyway. He sends it ahead to the city that will kill him. And he signs it. Charis, grace. AD 60, Paul is under arrest. Not in a dungeon. Not yet. He is under house arrest in Rome, chained to a rotating roster of Roman soldiers, awaiting trial before Caesar. He has appealed his case all the way to the imperial court, which was his right as a Roman citizen, and now he waits. The process will take 2 years. He is allowed visitors. He is allowed to write. So he writes 4 letters in 2 years, from one address in one city, with one chain connecting his wrist to the wrist of a man paid to make sure he does not leave. The first 3, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, are carried to their destinations by a man named Tychicus, who walks hundreds of miles with letters tucked inside his cloak. Paul calls him a dear brother and faithful servant. He is the postal system of the early church. He does not get a book named after him. Ephesians is the broadest of the prison letters. Less personal crisis, more cosmic vision. Paul writes about the church not as a local problem to be solved, but as something vast, something that spans every nation and era, something the powers of darkness themselves are watching. He writes about spiritual warfare, not as metaphor, but as reality. He writes about the armor of God from inside a cell, chained to a soldier wearing actual armor. You cannot read Ephesians without feeling the irony. But here's the part nobody tells you. The most joyful letter Paul ever wrote was written in those same chains. Philippians. The church at Philippi holds a special place in Paul's heart, unlike any other congregation. They are the first church he planted in Europe. The one that began with a prayer meeting beside a river and a businesswoman named Lydia, who opened her home to him. They have supported him financially for years, consistently when no other church did. They have sent him a man named Epaphroditus, described as his brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who nearly died making the journey to Rome just to bring Paul their gift. Paul writes back to thank them, and what he writes is astonishing. He uses the word joy or rejoice 16 times in 4 chapters, 16 times, in a letter written from chains by a man awaiting trial who does not know if he will be executed or released. He writes, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." He is not performing happiness. He is not pretending. He explains himself in chapter 4, and the explanation is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the New Testament. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Learned, not received, not gifted, not born with. Learned. The way you learn something that only costs you everything to acquire. He is telling you that contentment is not a personality type. It is not temperament. It is a skill, and the curriculum that teaches it is suffering. And Paul has completed every course. He writes, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You have seen that verse on water bottles and motivational posters. You have heard it quoted before athletic competitions. In context, Paul is talking about being hungry. He is talking about having nothing and being at peace with having nothing. That verse is not about winning. It is about surviving with your soul intact. Now, the 4th prison letter is different from the other 3. It is the shortest thing Paul ever wrote. 1 page, 1 subject, 1 man. His name is Onesimus. Onesimus is a slave. He belongs to a man named Philemon, a wealthy Christian in Colossae who hosts a church in his home and who owes Paul, as Paul delicately puts it, his very self. Onesimus has run away from Philemon, possibly after stealing from him, which under Roman law makes him not just a fugitive, but a criminal. A runaway slave caught in Rome could be crucified, could be branded, could be flogged to death as a warning to other slaves. Somehow, Onesimus ends up in contact with Paul in Rome. We do not know how. The text does not explain. What we know is that Paul leads him to faith, and then Paul sends him back to Philemon, back to the man he ran from. But Paul sends a letter with him. And the letter is extraordinary, not for its length, but for what Paul refuses to do in it. He does not command Philemon to free Onesimus, though he has the authority to do so. He does not invoke his apostleship. He does not argue theology. He begs. The Greek word is parakaleo again, the same word that ran through 2 Corinthians. Urge, implore, come alongside. Paul writes, I am appealing to you for my child, Onesimus, whose father I became while in chains. My child, a slave, a runaway, a man with no legal standing and no protection. Paul calls him his child. He asks Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a dear brother. He says, if he owes you anything, charge it to my account. I, Paul, will repay it. He is offering to pay the debt of a runaway slave out of his own pocket from inside a prison cell with no money. One page, one slave, one of the most quietly radical documents in the ancient world. The Roman Empire ran on slavery. Approximately 1 in 3 people in the city of Rome was enslaved. The institution was so foundational to the economy that questioning it was not just controversial, it was dangerous. Paul does not write a manifesto. He does not call for abolition. He writes one letter to one man about one person, and he uses the word brother. That word in that century, in that context, was not small. Hold that thought, because the 2 years of house arrest are ending. Paul is about to be released. He is about to go back on the road, older, slower, running out of time, and writing faster than ever. And somewhere in Rome, while Paul packs his things and prepares to leave, a fire is coming that will change everything. 6 letters down, 7 to go. 3 of them written in chains. Every one of them opened with charis. If you have made it this far, you already know this is not a typical Bible video. Share it with someone who needs to hear the end of this story, because the last 2 letters Paul ever wrote are coming. And one of them is a death row letter to a young man who may not have arrived in time. The fire starts on the night of July 18th, AD 64. It begins near the Circus Maximus, in the merchant stalls that crowd the base of the Palatine Hill, and it burns for 6 days before it is brought under control, then reignites and burns for 3 more. When it is finally over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts are damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are left homeless. The city that ruled the world is a field of ash and blackened stone. Nero needs someone to blame. The historian Tacitus, writing 50 years later, records what happens next. Nero points at the Christians. He calls them a group hated for their abominations, practitioners of a deadly superstition. The arrests begin, the executions begin. Tacitus describes what is done to them in terms so graphic that even he, a Roman writing for a Roman audience, calls it an act not of justice, but of cruelty. Paul is somewhere on the road when the fire happens. He has been released from his first Roman imprisonment. The 2 years of house arrest ended in acquittal, or simply expired. The historical record is not entirely clear. He is free. He is moving again. Macedonia, Asia Minor, Crete. the old routes, the old cities, the old urgency, but the world has changed while he was in chains. Now watch what happens next. He writes to Timothy in Ephesus. First Timothy, instructions for running a church, qualifications for leaders, warnings about false teachers. Paul is a general writing field orders to a young officer he loves like a son. He tells Timothy, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. He says it because he knows they will. He knows what it costs to stand in front of a room full of people who do not take you seriously and say what needs to be said anyway. He writes to Titus in Crete with the same urgency. Set things in order. Appoint elders. Hold firm to sound doctrine. The letters are practical, structured, focused. The letters of a man trying to build something that will outlast him because he is beginning to understand that it will need to. And then the second arrest comes. We do not know exactly when. We do not know who betrayed him or how he was found. What we know from Eusebius, the church historian writing in the 3rd century, is that Paul was rearrested, brought back to Rome. And this time, there was no house arrest, no visitors, no 2-year process with hope at the end of it. This time, the cell was underground. This time, the chain was not a formality. This time, he knew. He picks up the pen one final time. 2 Timothy, you need to sit with what this letter is. Paul's writing to his closest spiritual son, the young man he circumcised for the mission, the young man he called genuine in faith, the young man who received his first letter when he was a teenager and is now somewhere in his 30s, leading the church in Ephesus alone. Paul is writing from a death cell, and he begins not with theology, not with instructions, but with longing. I remember your tears. I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. He is not performing courage. He is not pretending the cell is comfortable or the outcome is unclear. He writes, I am ready, being poured out like a drink offering. A drink offering in the Jewish temple was the last thing poured after the sacrifice, after everything else. The final act. Paul is telling Timothy, I am the last drop. He asks him to come quickly. Before winter, he says. Before winter. Because the coat he asked for will not be enough if Timothy does not come before the cold sets in. He asks him to come and to bring Mark, the young man who had once abandoned the mission and whom Paul had once refused to take back. Forgiveness written into the last request. And then 19 centuries collapse because in 1944, in a prison called Tegel on the outskirts of Berlin, a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer sits in a cell and writes letters to his family and his fiancée while he waits to be executed by the Nazi state. He writes about faith and fear and what it means to live fully in the face of death. He writes, I don't think I've ever changed so much in a short time. He asks for books. He asks for news from the outside. He holds on to the people he loves through the only means he has left. Words on paper. 2 men, 2 cells, 19 centuries apart. Both of them writing because the alternative, silence, is the only real defeat. Paul's last letter ends with a list of names. Demas has deserted him, he says, loved this world and left. Alexander the metalworker did him great harm. At his first defense, no one came to support him. Everyone deserted him. He does not say this with bitterness. He says it plainly, the way you state a fact about weather. And then he says this, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Past tense. He is not hoping to finish. He is not trying to finish. He has finished. He knows it the way you know something when you have been paying attention for 30 years and the last piece finally falls into place. And then the request. Here it is, the thing planted at the very beginning of this story, the last thing Paul ever asked for. Not a lawyer, not a pardon, not a miracle. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments. His scrolls, his books, his parchments. A man in a death cell, weeks or months from execution, asking for more to read. This is not a story about a defeat. This is not a story about a man broken by a system. This is not a story about the end of something. This is what finishing looks like. Eusebius records the tradition. Paul was beheaded on the Ostian Way, outside the walls of Rome, under Nero. He was given the Roman execution, beheading, not crucifixion, because of his citizenship. A small mercy from a merciless state. The year was approximately AD 67 or 68. He was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. He had been writing for 16 years. Did Timothy make it in time? History does not say. The letter exists. Whether the reunion did, we do not know. We have the words. We do not have the ending. Maybe that is the point. 13 letters, 16 years, from Corinth to Rome, from a tent maker's bench to a death cell, from a young church terrified about the end of the world to an old man asking for his books before the end of his life. Here is what you need to take away from this. The first thing is this. Paul opened every single letter he ever wrote with the word charis, grace. Not one exception. Not in Galatians when he was furious. Not in 2 Corinthians when he was exhausted and wounded and listing his scars. Not in 2 Timothy when he was writing from a cell and asking a young man to come before winter. 13 letters, 13 times. The same word every time at the top of the page. Before the argument, before the confrontation, before the theology, before anything. Whatever else Paul believed, he believed that grace came first. Always first. Even in fury. Even in chains. Even at the end. The second thing is this. The most joyful letter Paul ever wrote came from prison. The most tender letter he ever wrote came from a death cell. Which means, whatever you are in the middle of right now, Paul wrote from inside something worse. And he wrote anyway. He did not wait for the circumstances to improve before he put words on a page. He did not wait until the chain was off his wrist, or the charges were dropped, or the emperor changed his mind. He wrote from exactly where he was, with exactly what he had, and the words outlasted the empire that tried to silence him. Nero is a footnote. Paul's letters are still being read. The third thing, and this is the one I want you to sit with. He asked for his scrolls, not a weapon, not a pardon, not a final meal or a last conversation with someone powerful, a coat, because the cold was coming, and his books. A man facing execution who wanted to keep reading, who believed in the last weeks of his life that the words were still worth something, that the thinking was still worth doing, that the mind God gave him was worth using all the way to the end. That is not a man who lost. That is a man who finished. Which of Paul's 13 letters has meant the most to you personally? Tell me below. I read every comment and I want to know. If this video helped you see Paul differently, share it with one person who needs to hear this story. And if you want to go deeper into the world of the early church, subscribe. There is more coming. 13 letters, 16 years, one life, poured out like a drink offering. And the last thing he asked for was more to read.